Hello, and welcome to the International Association for Impact Assessment virtual forum series, Think Big, 2050 City Megagrowth, Assessing and Addressing the Impacts. I'm Heather Goldstone, Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center and your moderator for today's session. Woodwell Climate is an independent nonprofit conducting science for solutions at the nexus of climate, people, and nature. We partner with communities and leaders around the globe for just meaningful impact to address the climate crisis. And increasingly, that means making actionable risk information accessible to communities, to business leaders, and to national policymakers. But unfortunately, at this point, you don't have to be a risk or impact expert to see the effects of our changing climate. Over the past few years, the impacts have become undeniable. And a study published in 2021 in Nature Climate Change found that at least 80% of the world's land area and at least 85% of our global population have already felt the impacts of climate change. In just the past couple of years, we've seen unprecedented heat in southwestern Canada, killing more than 600 people, unprecedented wildfires in Australia and in Greece, unprecedented flooding in Pakistan that killed more than 1,500 people and displaced hundreds of thousands. And while many of the world's most vulnerable live subsistence lifestyles in developing nations, over half of our global population currently lives in cities. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently highlighted the climate risks facing some of the world's largest cities, from Cairo to Shanghai to New York. These cities, of course, are also strong drivers of the problem, accounting for 2/3 of global energy consumption and more than 70% of global carbon emissions. In order to build a healthier, more equitable, and sustainable future, it's critical to consider both how to mitigate the risks that cities face and how city growth and development can become part of the global solution. This means policymakers and the public urgently need information about the environmental and social impacts of the options in front of them, both new actions and inaction. In response to this need, the International Association for Impact Assessment, IAIA, in collaboration with Cities Alliance, has organized this series of presentations supporting efforts to address the looming environmental and social impacts affecting the world's cities to 2050 and beyond. To kick things off, we turn to Peter Nelson. Peter is project lead for planninggreenfutures.org. He has over 40 years of experience in impact assessment and planning, including applying strategic environmental assessments, or SEAs, to water, minerals, planning, forestry, and natural resource conservation in Malawi, Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Tanzania, Montenegro, and Sierra Leone. He also has years of experience in regional planning, design, and assessment in Scotland. He holds a diploma in town and regional planning from the University of Leeds, a master's of science in environmental conservation from the University of Salford, and a bachelor's degree in physical geography from the University of Cambridge. His first presentation focuses on the potential for using strategic environmental assessments, or SEA, principles in coordinating an international response to the global challenges arising from resource depletion, population growth, climate change, biodiversity loss, human injustice and inequalities, technological change, and the failures of national leadership and international decision-making. Peter, over to you.
Hello, I'm Peter Nelson. I'm a land use planner, an environmental scientist, and a member of IAIA. During lockdown, I found myself at a loose end, and I decided to try and capture some of my thoughts, which I did in the form of a so-called strategic environmental assessment, unusual in the sense that it applied to the entire planet. The overall aim of the SEA is to start a public debate on the ways in which global decision-making takes place and the role of the public, and also to ask the question, was there a role for IAIA? There's a hypothesis behind the SEA, which is that as we stand on the gateway to artificial intelligence, unfortunately, human behavior suggests that we have very little of our own natural intelligence. Our technical skills enable us to modify the face of the earth, but diseases like Ebola and coronavirus remind us that even microscopic organisms can travel the globe in only a few days, and in the process wreak total havoc. We human beings are not yet masters of the universe, let alone in control of the earth. The SEA is broken down into 6 parts, and there are 26 chapters, so in a 10-minute address I can only touch on the basic outline. It looks at the evolution of human beings as a species over a period of 400,000 years, linking our development with the impacts of climate change, in this case natural. But as the graph shows, it's the last 100 years about which we now worry. In that period of the basically 2,000 years, world population of the human species has grown from 14 million, about the size of the city of Istanbul 2,000 years ago, to around 500 million in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. When I was born in 1946, I have to remember, the population of the planet was around 2.4 billion. In my lifetime, it has trebled to just under 8 billion. In parallel with the growth in population, there's been a massive increase in technology, as we all know. These slides are mirrored by the work that President Al Gore did when he produced An Inconvenient Truth. And significantly, in the last 500 years, there has been similar exponential growth in the use of land throughout the planet for both grazing and for crop production, in order to feed us all, with devastating effects on biodiversity, far more significant than the current impacts of climate change. So the SEA charts what those changes have been, both in terms of its environmental effects and its social impacts on communities, and critically in terms of our economic progress. And the basic message it presents is that the world is a very unequal place. There are 8 chapters which deal with this subject, and I'm only highlighting a few. For example, the fact that in half the world the population eats roughly half the recommended diet proposed by the World Health Organization. In the other half, people eat double the amount that's needed for survival, with the consequence that obesity is becoming one of the largest medical conditions and problems in the so-called developed world. We have major problems with the water distribution around the world, quite irrespective of climate change. 2 billion people face water scarcity daily, and 4 billion, that's over half the world's population, literally shit in the bush. Sorry if it offends, but that's the reality. The World Health Organization message during the coronavirus at its peak was wash hands and face, maintain your space. It's a nice ringing tone to it, but it's not easy when there's no water to drink, soap is priceless, and 10 people sleep in a room, as they do here in Sierra Leone, where I'm talking to you now. Poverty around the world is still a fundamental issue for more than 10% of the world population. And it's a total irony that just over 2,000 billionaires actually own more money than 60% of the world population. That's 4.3 billion people. Figures from Oxfam at last year's Davos conference. Well, many people say, sure, problems are difficult, but advances in technology will allow us to work our way out of such difficulties. Again, the SEA examines some of those potential areas, but in concluding, it examines the balance between what needs to be spent to correct some fairly fundamental and basic issues of inequality, and concludes that those costs are about 3% of global GDP. On the other hand, the economists demonstrate that they would bring a reward 6 times higher in terms of so-called economic progress. All of this leads us to the question of how are we governed and how do we make our decisions? And the SEA concludes with a part which examines the role that different types of administration, from democracies to dictatorships and to communal groups, reach critical decisions. It concludes that there is a need for an international body with real teeth and real power, and looks at the work of the United Nations, which is literally only 75 years old. In 400,000 years of progress, we have only got round to considering a global response in the last 75 years. So the conclusions from the SA analysis is that although significant progress in technological development is taking place in the richest nations, it will take a very long time for that to filter down to the 60% of the world's poorest nations. There's a massive and growing divide between rich and poor, healthy and sick people, prosperous and impoverished nations. No individual, no group of scientists, no community or nation has any idea where all of this development is actually leading civilization. We have no roadmap. And with these sobering thoughts, we need to consider whether there is a role for the United Nations. So this concludes the first part of my presentation, the global position. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Peter. A really thought-provoking start to the series. Our next presenter is Weston A. Fisher. Wes has over 30 years experience as an impact assessment practitioner and capacity development professional in less developed countries, including time living in Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, Botswana, and Lesotho. He has been a trainer and facilitator in EIA in 21 countries, and he joined the International Association for Impact Association in 2002. He was a key organizer of 2 IAIA climate change symposia at the World Bank and Aalborg, Denmark in 2010. He received IAIA's Outstanding Service Award in 2014 and 2022, and has served as co-chair of the climate change section since 2011. He was instrumental in the development of IAIA's Climate Change Action Plan and currently oversees its implementation. He holds a Master of Science in Geology and Bachelor's in Biology from Stanford University. And today he's going to share his thoughts on mitigating the long-term cumulative impacts of urban megagrowth, asking what role city growth and development might play in reversing potentially catastrophic changes to the biosphere resulting from human activity. How do we select among mitigation alternatives for 2050 strong sustainability in city development strategies? What steps are needed to improve the city development strategy process through strategic environmental and social impact assessments and cumulative effects sustainability analysis? And he promises to share with us some reasons he sees for optimism.
I'm Wes Fisher, co-chair of the International Association for Impact Assessment's Climate Change section. I'm a biologist and geologist by training, and I'm speaking to you here from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm going to be talking to you about 2050 city megagrowth, mitigating long-term cumulative impacts. Be covering 4 different topics: our global predicament, reversing the impacts of changes to the biosphere, 2050 urban megagrowth, what are the trends, city development strategies and climate change action plans, and sustainable cities. How do we mitigate against long-term cumulative impacts? And how to select among mitigation alternatives for 2050 strong sustainability. And I've capitalized the word strong here. Sustainability can mean many things to many people depending on your point of view, but strong sustainability criteria be linked directly to what is happening to the biosphere and the threats that are in front of us now. Improving the CDS process through strategic environmental and social impact assessment and cumulative effects sustainability analysis, and some reasons for optimism. Emergent conditions that are driving rapid social and economic change. And then I'll finish with some summary thoughts. Our predicament. Here, a number of you may have seen this graphic before. It comes from the Stockholm Resiliency Center, and it shows overshoot of different planetary boundaries. Those that are in orange are the ones that have advanced the furthest. Climate change, clearly, mainly due to CO2 emissions and ocean acidification, biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, perturbed biogeochemical cycling. This is mainly the release of nitrogen and phosphorus to our oceans and rivers, and the effects of our agricultural activities on the planet. Land use and land cover change, also in orange, and then the remaining ones, freshwater abstraction, systemic chemical pollution, again, what's happening, what we're putting into the oceans, rivers, and air, and altered atmospheric physics and chemistry. So these are interacting pressures, and they are building up fast. Here's another depiction. This one is from a paper titled Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future. And it's from the Frontiers of Conservation Science back in January of 21, written by 17 conservation science professionals. And if you look at the list, it's Earth's surface, oceans, kelp forests, seagrass meadows, large predatory fishes, and live coral cover. I've seen the recent news on the Australian reef, territorial vegetation, wetland area, free-flowing rivers, terrestrial biodiversity, vertebrate population size, wild mammals, endangered plants, and threatened species. This particular slide is one that is of concern to impact professionals like myself. On the left, you see a depiction of the decline in wildlife populations from 1970. The similar graphic could be shown for what's happening to plant species. But on the right are the number of studies, starting in 1974, publications of environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments. They've been rising exponentially. Clearly, something is not quite right. Now let's look at the trends. According to the World Bank Urban Development Overview, the world's cities contain over 4 billion people, more than half the global population. The urban population is 9 times larger than it was 100 years ago. Urban growth is expected to continue, more than doubling to greater than 9 billion of us, with nearly 7 of 10 people in the world living in cities by 2050. And currently, urban areas consume 2/3 of the world's energy and create over 70% of global CO2 emissions. And just parenthetically, just in the last few weeks, our world population topped 8 billion. This shows the trend in urbanization. 1950, 30%. By 2050, 68% of us are in urban environments. And this is the big question. Is 21st century urbanization out of control? And this happens to be a photograph of Mexico City in 2018. This is just a screenshot from work done by the Ontario Tech University. And they have a research center that focuses on population projections going out to 2100, and really examining the largest cities in the world as well. And this shows, this is for 2050 shows the top 6. And you can see number 1's Mumbai, then Delhi, then Dhaka, then Kinshasa, then Calcutta, and finally Lagos. And by 2100, Lagos is supposed to surpass all of these and become the largest city in the world. This is, I think, a particularly telling formula. I being environmental impact or impacts, P being population, A, affluence, and T, technology. And if P and grows significantly, that has a major effect on overall environmental and global impacts. Also applies locally. Of course, affluence also significantly affects impacts and technology, good or bad. Do we fully grasp how serious this is? If so, what do we do next? Now in play are very positive public and private sector interests. Despite what we see on social media and in politics, which, in spite of strong resistance, are creating transformational change. Youth, students, and their assessments of the future will become a major factor in restoring biosphere stability, along with science-based data. While many existing centers of political, economic, and personal power remain locked in patterns of unsustainable growth, the arguments in favor of maintaining a sustainable commons in biosphere are reaching a wider and wider audience, with major shifts in the financial and corporate world now taking place. And I think what I would say is that those with wealth and power have kids and grandkids and are increasingly aware of what is taking place globally. That this together with pressure from scientists and from youth are going to create a significant shift in how we deal with our biosphere. Through continuing emergence of new information systems for global and local problem solving and the exponential evolutionary changes in digital communication and artificial intelligence, I think rapid societal change is showing itself in enlightened political and economic and financial leaders, the reinsurance and insurance industry, the academic and corporate world, the science journalists, and educated populations. And here's something from C4 Cities. C4 Cities was originally formed with backing from Bloomberg and others to look at 40 of the mega cities in the world. The network has expanded significantly since its founding. C40 notes that the significant accomplishments in climate change mitigation and adaptation can be attributed to city mayors being directly accountable to their constituents for their decisions and for being more nimble than state and national elected officials to take decisive action. What our cities do individually and in unison to address climate change can set the agenda for communities and governments everywhere. So I think this is a very important observation on the part of C40. Based on the accountability and responsiveness of many urban mayors, the existence of effective urban planning bodies and city development plans, many cities have begun to address climate change and overshoot from other global impacts in a serious fashion. Urban and land use planners and IA, impact assessment specialists, must be able to convey the grave urgency of mitigating these impacts and provide alternative strategies for addressing them. This requires effective use a strategic environmental and social impact assessment that focuses on long-term cumulative environmental and social effects, and the mitigation strategies for city development strategies and regional plans to 2050 and into the next century. Well, in the course of Nature's Reminders, we can look at our own IAI's climate change section's response. Like the efforts of urban planning bodies, impact assessment practitioners see the urgent need for action. Yet after years of effort, we continue to encounter policymakers, decision makers, and a public who have only limited understanding of how to proceed in a way that incorporates the do no harm principles, basically the same principles used by medical practitioners, and ethical principles of CDSs and impact assessment into a major, rapid, and efficient transition to a sustainable global economy. The experience of our climate change section has placed major focus on the action plan an action plan that contains efforts to reach beyond our own profession and build collaborative relationships with the following groups. So what we've done is establish technical advisory groups to reach out to the following groups: environmental law organizations, financial institutions, the insurance, reinsurance industry, and risk assessment specialists, with a focus on strong sustainability criteria for making financial and corporate decisions that are not greenwashing, that represent a direct connection to planetary boundary issues. Urban and regional planners and decision makers, that's the reason for this series. And we have a technical advisory group led by Ahmed Sanda from Nigeria, and we also have an initiative to reach out to environmental journalists. I wanted to bring this to your attention. This is a Cities Alliance guide to the city preparation of city development strategies. A very useful document. It covers 4 phases in the planning process. Where are we now? Where are we going? How we're going to get there? And how to implement and know we're on track. And I'm only going to touch on a little bit on phase 3. How are we going to get there? This is a diagram from a paper written way back in 2008. Authors include Maria Rosario Partadario, the primary author, who is one of the early founders of our association, and Marcus Eggenberger, who we work with on the urban planning technical group. And it shows the link, the connection between the city development strategies and the SEA process. This is from the guide, and these are definitions of environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment from the guide. The question is, what's missing? The most important part of these exercises of doing an impact assessment is to look at alternatives and alternative strategies and approaches to actual mitigation. So the mitigation and monitoring plans that the impact flowing from the impact assessment process. So that's the most important part. And cumulative effects are particularly hard for impact assessment professionals to handle. Do it on the project level reasonably well, but on the regional level or national level, much more difficult, and to do it over a long length of time. So within the guide, there are these tools. There are also tools for climate change action, incorporating impact assessment process. However, not much dealing with long-term cumulative effects and how we are going to address as professionals. Similarly, here's another one from the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities, the same issue. Difficulty coming to grips with the cumulative impacts over the long term. And another, this is from C4 Cities, the same issue. I wanted to bring this to your attention. This is a report, Cities Alliance report. They contracted with another one of our truly illustrious impact assessment professionals, Barney Walmsley of the Southern African Institute for Environmental Assessment. And she was looking at SEAs in sub-Saharan Africa. How are sub-Saharan African countries doing with incorporating SEAs into city development plans and programs and strategies? And she found that there is a real lack of capacity to do these and do them well, and much more investment is going to be needed to make it effective, to really be useful. Should mention that Bryony's report is available online from Cities Alliance, as well as an online presentation of her findings. As urban planners and practitioners, it's past time for us to join forces to ensure greater attention to long-term cumulative impacts and mitigation strategies for climate change and other global impacts, environmental and social development strategies, and of course, environmental justice. So we need to be banding together. I want to bring this to your attention as a potential model for SCA practice, strategic environmental assessment work done for the city of Edinburgh. And there are a cluster of other cities in Scotland that also serve as useful models. Now let's talk a little bit about new directions. Linking city development strategies and strategic environmental and social impact assessments and cumulative effects analyses to global standards. And in this case, these are standards for nature-based solutions developed by IUCN. And with these standards, if they are used by the financial industry and by corporations, they give us a much more science-based data to work from to establish strong sustainability criteria. And similarly, here is a integrated biodiversity assessment tool, considered the world's most authoritative biodiversity data for your world-shaping decisions. Again, this is coming from IBAT, which is a collaborative group pulling this data together for use in decision-making, policy-making. So again, it's the kind of criteria we need to make sound, strong sustainability decisions. And this, science-based targets. This nonprofit entity consists of more than 1,000 businesses working with science-based targets to reduce their emissions in line with climate science. So moving away from greenwashing to kind of making use of what's best available data on the planet. And this group, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, launched for COP26 by the former Bank of England, Mark Carney, also with support from Bloomberg and others, promising to follow scientific guidelines for cutting carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. So if they keep the promise, then potentially 450 financial firms across 45 countries will be moving their investment decisions down the strong sustainability pathway. So what does all this mean for urban planners and strategic environmental and social impact assessment specialists? Well, why does strong sustainability in urban planning not receive greater political traction? First of all, those with vested interest tend not to react well or quickly to calls for major change, unless they've come to recognize that proposed changes are in their best interest. And I do think this is we're seeing this a very rapid shift now in how the folks who control wealth and power in societies are becoming increasingly aware of the need to act now. So the one thing to keep in mind, however, is that it's not characteristic of our species to fully grasp the consequences of our actions over long time horizons or to plan ahead, especially beyond 2 generations. So that's where a constant educational push becomes so important. Urban planners and IA practitioners are like guides. They try to get their maps read before journeys begin to find the best paths and do no harm. So get in before starting out on the journey. Get urban planners and ESAI practitioners together early on when concepts are first taking shape and not after designs become done deals. To reverse the drastic deterioration in planetary climate conditions and address very dangerous overshoot from other global impacts, we must take our skills beyond our professional planning and IA, impact assessment affiliations, as I am sure many of you are already doing. Find a group that's action-oriented and jump in. Are they a dynamic planning institution, an effective environmental law group, a network of financial institutions, reinsurance specialists, risk analysts, city planning bodies, student activists, journalists? Any of these groups can benefit from your planning and strategic environmental and social impact assessment knowledge and discipline. Stay involved with groups like Cities Alliance and ICLEI and ISOCARP and C4 Cities and the Commonwealth of Mayors and IAIA to expand your knowledge and professional practice and discipline. But in this time of emergency, we'll have to do more. Talking to ourselves is important, but doesn't address why our work receives little attention beyond our own circle of professionals and supporters. Push for opportunities to engage a wider audience in understanding the value and elements of city development strategy preparation, strategic environmental and social assessment, and long-term cumulative effects analysis. So this is a graphic representation of the whole as more than the parts, which is first one of Aristotle's observations on emergent phenomenon of what's in those termites that that results in their building a structure like this to house their population, keep it cool in an African setting. A new global financial development institution similar to the World Bank system. Would be it's being talked about more and more. It was a major topic of conversation at COP27 to address the full range of urban megagrowth issues, incorporating strong sustainability standards linked to planetary boundary conditions and family planning initiatives. Innovative financing. There were social bonds, for example, social bonds, green bonds that do not increase national indebtedness. A very difficult and tricky initiatives that need to be taken. A global biosphere data and analytical support to support strong sustainability criteria. And also, coming back to this issue of reforming the World Bank and meeting shared global challenges, I invite you to take a look at the work of the Center for Global Development. The people who are a part of this, both the board and the staff, have backgrounds in throughout the World Bank and the IMF and the financial world. The concern that financial considerations, economic considerations may dominate these reforms, probably real, but these folks know the business, and if you listen to them, their concerns for the planet and our future are very real. Here is sort of a looking at population, and if we look at the UN Population Fund, they've done costing for 3 transformative results. And the one that I want you to look at in particular is end the unmet need for family planning. What the estimated cost between 2020 and 2030 was $68.5 billion, of which about $8.6 billion was funded, made available as development assistance at the country level. New investment needed $59.9 billion. And what's interesting here are the figures for what has been spent on Ukraine by the US so far, and the request for additional funding. So you can see that just one war, without that war, if we were to reinvest or if we could reduce our military spending globally, just a few percentage points, we would have the resources to meet those family planning needs. And I just want to emphasize this again: education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. That's Nelson. And I've added parenthetically some of my own wording here. The health of democratic societies is significantly affected by the degree to which their populations are grounded in critical thinking and ethical behavior from youth to adult, especially youth. And city development strategies and strategic ESII supports both, as well as stakeholder participation early on in the process, and transparency. And here are my coordinates. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the series.
Thank you so much, Wes. With that as a foundation, we're now going to return to Peter Nelson for a closer examination of current cumulative urban, environmental, and social impacts, with specific examples from Sierra Leone.
I want to consider the planning issues that relate to the movement of people from rural areas to the major cities. I've been lucky to work in a range of planning situations, from national plans to regional and structural plans, and also at community level. And I have to say that in all of them, the role of environmental assessment and strategic assessment has been critical. I think the role of environmental assessment is to help to measure the gaps that exist between policies, strategies, plans and programs, and the gaps that exist between the actual aspirations and commitments on the one hand and the ways, means and ends of delivery. For example, the United Nations 11th Sustainability Development Goal states by 2030, citizens will be inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. Well, that's only 8 years from today. And yet, if we look at the growth and expansion of cities around the world, we now have 34 megacities holding each more than 10 million people. And it's a harsh reality that 1 in 3 of those urban dwellers actually live in slum conditions, defined as a group of individuals living under the same roof, lacking one or more of the following conditions: access to clean water, improved sanitation, sufficient space, and durability of housing. In the earlier presentation, I talked about population growth. And if we look from the present day, 2020, towards the end of the century, what we see is a range in projections from around 14 billion in the population, a doubling, to an actual decline of about 1 billion. But what is incontrovertible is that there will be population growth of the order of 2 billion people in the next 50 years. And this has massive implications for planning in general. This slide illustrates how population is changing around the world. And I want to emphasize, when I talk about population, I'm not advocating any form of population control, simply a realistic assessment of what the implications are for the way we manage our resources and the planet. What we see is that in North America, South America and Europe, population remains more or less static or declines slightly. In Asia, there's expected to be a substantial decline. But what happens in Africa is what really matters, because that is where the 2 billion population expansion is expected to take place. And it will result in major shifts in the balance of world population. And we're all familiar with the fact that China and India are the largest countries in terms of population in the world. But few people know that by 2100, it's predicted that it will be an African country that is the second largest, only a little behind India, and putting China into third place, and that's Nigeria. And in the top 10 countries, over 6 will be African nations. The other major change which is expected in light of the recent past is the progression of movement for people from rural areas into city areas in search of work and resources. And so, at the present time, we have roughly half the world's population in cities. But by 2100, it's anticipated that over 85% will be in cities, and almost 3/4 of the world's population will be in urban areas by 20. This slide simply illustrates the way in which different parts of the world and different cities are expected to grow. I mentioned already that Nigeria is expected to be the second most populous country in the world by 2100. And the remarkable fact is that Lagos is anticipated to have over 80 million population. Well, all of this has significant implications in terms of how we provide water, how we provide enough food, and all of that, of course, needs to be produced in the rural areas surrounding the city regions. So it's not simply the question of how do we manage the cities themselves, but how do we manage the transport of resources the movement of resources, whether it's water, minerals, people, or food. And I'm giving the example from Sierra Leone. Here in West Africa, just as population is speculative in terms of growth, so is the impact of climate change. But I can tell you it's raining hard now, and we're already 1 month into the dry season, and temperatures are also expected to rise from anything from 1 degree to 6 degrees by 2001. This is a scene from 2 miles from the city centre of Freetown. It is original, untouched rainforest. And here is a picture on the opposite side of the same hill, where the land has been largely denuded, deforested, both to produce minerals, but also to permit housing for the 1.5 increasing to 2 million people who now live in the congested centre of France. And providing water for that number of people is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. This is the Goma Dam, where we've done some recent studies on the impact of climate change, where even a delay of 3 weeks in the onset of the rains would leave a city of 1.5 million without water. The slide was taken in 2016, when the second of 3 intakes was left dry. A significant issue for all cities is the condition of the infrastructure, and in this case, it's aging pipes first laid in the Victorian era. And the consequences of both limited water supply and poor infrastructure is the daily struggle to provide enough water. But as housing development takes place on the hillsides, it has other unintended consequences, like the mudslide on the 14th of August 2017, which overnight resulted in the death of more than 1,000 people, not from the fall itself, but from the mud that engulfed the lower parts of the river valley. And yet another of the issues which exists in a city like Freetown and in many other African countries is the state of the river systems, where garbage and rubbish accumulates, often due to the problems of waste management itself, but also from congestion and illegal housing extending right into the river channel itself, to the point where the channels can actually become dry land. And yet, when the rains fall, these channels have to carry all the water, resulting in yet another hazard, which is flooding, and that in turn results in many severe issues for communities. So, in concluding my presentation, the points that I really want to stress are that we cannot ignore the impact of population growth, the dynamics of population movement from rural to urban areas, and the realities of living conditions in most of the world's cities. And it is frankly kidology to assume that cities are going to be sustainable and safe by 2030, and the world needs to wake up. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you, Wes and Peter, for your excellent presentations and kicking off this virtual series. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. I look forward to seeing you again in the second session.